The movie begins with a police detective named Bowden, who talks about the devil, saying that the devil's goal is to make people sinners and unbelievers so that they become cursed on earth and are killed. If a suicide happens, the devil appears at the location where the incident took place and disguises himself as a human. He then enters a place where sinners gather, and there he traps and kills them one by one as a form of punishment. The scene then shifts to a worker who jumps from a high commercial tower and lands on a truck. The impact is so strong that the truck moves on its own down the road. At the same time, Detective Bowden is sitting with a friend, telling him that he's in a bad state mentally because he hasn't been able to catch the criminal who killed his family 5 years ago. His friend advises him to forget about it and move on so that he can live his life. Ignoring his friend's advice, Bowden goes to the site where the worker jumped from the tower and finds the truck with the worker in front of a 2-story building. His colleague suggests that it might be a murder and that someone might have pushed the worker off. Bowden climbs onto the truck and finds the worker holding prayer beads in his hand with no signs of assault, indicating that it was indeed a suicide and not a murder. However, Bowden suspects that the worker didn't jump from that building because it's impossible for someone to fall from the 2nd floor and die. He then notices water on the ground coming from a slope and deduces that the truck moved from the slope to reach the building. Following the trail, Bowden discovers that the worker committed suicide from a commercial tower in front of the building. Inside the tower, a security guard named Larson is talking to his colleague, telling him that he will deliver an envelope to a law firm on the 39th floor and that he will take the stairs because he has a phobia of elevators and closed spaces. His colleague convinces him to take the elevator so that he doesn't get delayed or docked pay at work. Reluctantly, Larson listens to him and gets on the elevator with 4 other people. Suddenly, the elevator stops on the 30th floor. One of the security guards monitoring the cameras notices the malfunction and alerts the maintenance worker, telling him to fix the elevator quickly because there are 5 people trapped inside. Larson presses the emergency button and argues with the other passengers because he doesn't have a radio to communicate with the security guards. Frustrated, he tells them that he's new on the job. Before he can finish his sentence, a security guard speaks to them through the elevator microphone, informing them that the maintenance worker will fix the elevator within 10 minutes. Larson is worried because he might be late for work and could be fired. He tries to call his colleague to let him know he's trapped in the elevator and that the delivery will be late, but his phone has no signal. The other passengers realize that none of their phones have a signal except for one woman named Sarah, who finds that her phone does have a signal. She hands it to Larson to call his colleague. Larson thanks her and makes the call, but unfortunately, his colleague can't hear him well and the signal cuts off. Meanwhile, Detective Bowden notices a broken glass window in front of the commercial tower and suspects that something happened inside. Suddenly, a glass panel falls on him and his colleague, but they quickly move out of the way, narrowly avoiding injury. The maintenance worker then goes to the electrical cabin and informs the passengers that he will cut the power for 20 seconds to check if the elevator's malfunction is due to an electrical issue. As soon as the lights go out, the elderly woman in the elevator screams and Larson grabs her in fear. Everyone becomes suspicious of him, and he explains that when he was a child, his brother locked him in a coffin for 6 hours, and since then, he's been terrified of enclosed spaces. He's visibly distressed and struggling to breathe. Tony, one of the other passengers, feels sorry for him and opens a vent in the ceiling to let in some air. Larson thanks him and suggests they escape through the ceiling vent, but Tony refuses, saying they are on the 30th floor. The maintenance worker then contacts the security guard monitoring the cameras and tells him that he found no electrical issues with the elevator and will go to the lower level to check the main wires controlling the elevator. While talking, another security guard named Ramirez, who is monitoring the elevator cameras, notices that the lights keep flickering and sees a strange face appear on the camera, only to disappear quickly. The maintenance worker reaches the lower level and contacts the security guard, telling him that all the elevator wires are intact and that the only solution is to manually operate the elevator from the upper level to bring it down to the ground floor, allowing the passengers to exit. After ending the call, another malfunctioning elevator falls on the maintenance worker, but luckily, nothing happens to him. At the same time, the lights go out in the elevator again, and Sarah screams until the lights come back on. They then notice scratches on Sarah's back, leaving everyone puzzled and not understanding what's happening. Coincidentally, one of the passengers, Tim, finds blood on his clothes and tries to hide it, fearing that others will suspect him of harming Sarah. However, everyone sees the blood and accuses him of having a knife and being responsible for Sarah's injuries. They decide to search him. The security guards notice Sarah's wound on the camera and decide to call the police before a crime occurs in the elevator. Ramirez, the security guard, shows his colleague the strange face he saw and tells him that there will be a massacre in the elevator if these people aren't rescued soon. Shortly after, Detective Bowden arrives and the security guards tell him what happened as they communicate with the passengers through the elevator intercom. The microphone, unfortunately, does not work, so Bowden joins the passengers and asks them to show their ID cards to the camera so he can investigate and find out who hurt Sarah. They do as he asks, but due to the poor quality of the camera, he cannot clearly see their names. Bowden then goes to the reception to check the list of names of those who entered the building and asks his colleague to identify the passengers using the list. Just then, the power goes out in the elevator and the passengers hear a noise. When the power returns, they find that the elevator mirror is shattered and Tim is dead with glass in his neck. The guard, Ramirez, informs Bowden of what happened and takes him to the camera room. Bowden starts to suspect that the guard, Larson, who is in the elevator, is the one who killed Tim, and he asks his colleague to gather information about Larson as quickly as possible. Before he can finish his conversation, Ramirez tells him that everything that happened is the work of the devil. The devil appears in places where suicide incidents occur, disguises himself as a human, and enters a location where a group of sinners is present, killing them all. They realize that one of the passengers in the elevator is the devil, but Detective Bowden ignores Ramirez's words and continues monitoring to identify the criminal. Unfortunately, he finds no evidence, as the power was out when the crime occurred. By chance, Bowden notices a letter in Tim's pocket, so he asks the passengers to take the letter and show it to the camera. Tony takes the letter and shows it to Bowden, who then sees the logo of a business management company located on the 35th floor. Bowden concludes that Tim was on his way to that company, so they investigate further about Tim. On the way, Bowden meets some firefighters and asks them to break down the elevator door to rescue the passengers. At that moment, Tony opens the elevator's ceiling hatch and looks at the wires, trying to figure out the cause of the elevator malfunction. But Larson, thinking Tony is trying to escape, pulls him back inside the elevator and declares that no one will leave the elevator until the police find out who killed Tim. Bowden then speaks with the manager of the business management company and asks what he knows about Tim. The manager informs him that Tim was a con artist who swindled many people, leading one of them to commit suicide. Bowden returns to the camera room and asks his colleague to review the building's entry records because the killer likely did not register their name. The guard, Ramirez, shows Bowden a strange face he saw on the cameras and insists that the devil is in the elevator and more murders will occur. Bowden tells Ramirez that he doesn't believe in the devil, stating that humans are evil enough on their own. To explain his reasoning, Bowden gives Ramirez a paper that says, "I'm sorry," and tells him that a criminal wrote this note after crashing into his wife's car 5 years ago, killing both her and their son. The criminal then fled and has never been found. After finishing his story, Bowden watches the cameras and sees the passengers in the elevator searching each other to ensure no one has a weapon. Meanwhile, the elevator technician reaches the top of the elevator and begins to descend using a rope to manually operate it. Suddenly, bats appear, causing him to lose his balance, and the rope snaps, causing him to fall onto the elevator, killing him. The passengers notice blood dripping from the ceiling and realize that the technician fell onto the hatch, which was their last hope. At this point, Bowden goes to check on the technician and finds him dead. He instructs the firefighters to start breaking through the wall next to the elevator to rescue the passengers immediately. Bowden's colleague arrives with the names of the passengers in the elevator, obtained from the building's entry records. They discover that the old woman named Jane had stolen from someone in the building before entering the elevator, and that all the passengers except Tony had registered their names. This makes Bowden suspicious of Tony. He reviews the surveillance footage of Tony entering the building and realizes that Tony had a bag with him when he entered but boarded the elevator without it. Suddenly, the power goes out in the elevator, and all the passengers are terrified. As usual, they hear a noise, and when the power comes back, they find the old woman murdered. Detective Bowden, watching everything unfold, is unable to identify the killer. He decides to search for the bag Tony had when he entered the building and finds it hidden under the sink in the bathroom, containing repair tools. Bowden is puzzled by why Tony hid the bag in the bathroom. Meanwhile, Tony notices that Larson is no longer afraid of enclosed spaces as he had claimed earlier, leading him to suspect that Larson is the killer and has been lying to gain their sympathy and avoid suspicion. Tony confronts Larson and they start fighting until Bowden sees them through the cameras and orders them to stop fighting and raise their hands to prevent any further contact. Bowden then speaks with Ramirez and tells him that he is starting to believe the devil's story because his mother used to tell him this story, but he never believed it. Bowden asks what the devil's goal is and Ramirez explains that the devil is there to kill all the passengers as punishment for their past sins and crimes. Just then, Bowden's colleague arrives and informs him that he investigated Sarah and discovered that she has a criminal record with the police and used to have illicit relationships with wealthy businessmen, threatening to expose them if they didn't pay her large sums of money. They also learned that Sarah was on her way to meet a lawyer on the 42nd floor because she wanted to divorce her wealthy husband and take half of his fortune. Bowden realizes that her husband is the owner of the security company in the building, the same company Larson works for, leading Bowden to suspect that her husband sent Larson to kill her. Bowden quickly returns to the camera room and sees the power go out again. He says that Larson will definitely kill Sarah, but when the power returns, he is surprised to find Larson is the one who dies, which terrifies Sarah and scares Tony, leading them to suspect each other as the killer. They both grab a piece of glass to defend themselves. Detective Bowden tries to calm them down and orders them to drop the glass. They follow his instructions and throw the glass away, but Sarah secretly keeps a piece of glass in her pocket. At this moment, the firefighters are about to break through the wall, but the power goes out again as usual, and Sarah starts screaming. When the lights come back on, Bowden is surprised to find out that Tony is a mechanic and that he had left his tool bag in the bathroom because he was going to a job interview in the building and, of course, didn't want to take the tools with him. Bowden is puzzled by this and begins to feel that Tony might be innocent. He asks for Tony's full name, and Sarah reveals that his name is Tony Jane and that he registered under his father's name, Jane, in the entry records. Bowden is shocked because he initially thought the old woman's name was Jane. Suddenly, the old woman appears standing in front of Tony, and it turns out that she is actually the devil, who had disguised himself as the old woman because no one would ever suspect that. The devil then confronts Tony, asking if he is ready to die and be judged for the crime he committed years ago. Tony is flooded with memories from 5 years ago when he was driving drunk and suddenly crashed into a car carrying a woman and her child, killing them both because he was speeding. At the time, he left a note on the car saying he was sorry and then fled. Bowden is shocked to realize that Tony is the criminal he has been searching for over the past 5 years. Tony, overwhelmed with guilt, talks to the devil and begs to be killed so he can pay for his crime. The devil gets angry and makes the elevator descend rapidly to the ground floor, telling Tony that God will never forgive his sins. At that moment, Tony notices a walkie-talkie that had fallen from the maintenance worker and uses it to communicate with Bowden. He confesses that he hit a car with a woman and her child inside and caused their deaths. Instead of taking them to the hospital, he was too scared of going to prison, so he fled. Tony admits that he is a coward and that he regrets what he did, feeling that he deserves to be punished, but he hopes that God will forgive him. Bowden is stunned and realizes that he has finally found the criminal he had been searching for. At that moment, Tony notices that the devil is unable to harm him, understanding that God has forgiven his sins because he confessed them. The devil then disappears and the firefighters are finally able to open the elevator door. Tony is rescued and Bowden takes him in his car to the police station, where he will face punishment for his crime. On the way, Bowden reveals to Tony that the family he killed was his own, telling him that he prayed every day to find the criminal who killed his family so he could get revenge. However, after what happened in the elevator, he realized that revenge is a crime and that he would not find peace through vengeance. Bowden decides to forgive Tony and hopes that God will forgive him too. The movie ends. If you finished the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more movie summaries. Thanks for listening, my loves. See you in another video.